Whispers Across the Channel by Oliver Hale. The English Channel stretched before her like a vast gray carpet, its surface rippling under the persistent autumn breeze. Eleanor Bennett stood at the edge of the white cliffs of Dover, her scarf fluttering like a pennant in the wind. The distant French coastline was invisible today, shrouded in mist and the uncertainty of war. She tucked a strand of chestnut hair behind her ear and squinted at the horizon. Somewhere across those waters, William was fighting. Or perhaps he was already gone, like so many others. The letter in her coat pocket was worn from constant reading, its creases deep and permanent. 3 months without word, not unusual in wartime, she reminded herself, but the silence weighed on her nonetheless. "You'll catch your death out here, Miss Bennett," called a familiar voice. Eleanor turned to see Mrs. Hargrove trudging toward her, the older woman's sturdy frame wrapped in layers against the chill. "I needed the air, Mrs. Hargrove," Eleanor replied, forcing a smile. "The hospital was difficult today." The older woman nodded, understanding in her eyes. As the matron of the military hospital where Eleanor worked as a nurse, Mrs. Hargrove had seen the toll the war took on everyone, especially the young women waiting for their men to return, if they returned at all. "New convoy came in," Mrs. Hargrove said. "We'll need all hands. Some of them are from Dunkirk." Eleanor's pulse quickened. William had been at Dunkirk, or at least nearby, according to his last letter. "I'll be right there." The walk back to the hospital was brisk, their breath clouding the air before them. Eleanor's thoughts raced ahead. She wouldn't allow herself to hope. Hope was dangerous these days, but she couldn't help the quickening of her step. St. Mary's Hospital had once been a school, its classrooms now transformed into wards. The halls echoed with moans, hurried footsteps, and the occasional burst of laughter, life asserting itself even here. Eleanor tied on her apron, adjusted her cap, and steeled herself before entering Ward C. The ward was chaos, nurses and doctors moving between beds, calling for supplies, checking bandages. The smell of antiseptic barely covered the underlying sense of blood and fear. Eleanor moved to her station, where Dr. Collins was already barking orders. "Bennett, take beds 12 through 20. Check bandages, record vitals, standard procedure. Make it quick, we've got more coming." Eleanor nodded, her training taking over as she moved to the first bed. The young man was unconscious, his face swathed in bandages. The chart indicated shell fragments to the face and upper body. She worked methodically, bed by bed, offering words of comfort, checking wounds, recording information. At bed 16, she nearly dropped her clipboard. It wasn't William. Of course it wasn't. The soldier had similar coloring, similar build, but the face was wrong, broader, with a scar along the jawline that William didn't have. "Miss," the soldier's voice was raspy, his accent distinctly American. "Could I trouble you for some water?" Eleanor shook off her disappointment and reached for the pitcher. Of course. She helped him sit up slightly to drink. "You're a long way from home." He managed a weak smile. "Volunteered before we officially entered. Figured you folks could use the help." "Lieutenant James Harrison," she read from his chart, "Royal Air Force. Eagle Squadron," he confirmed. "Americans flying for Britain. Or I was, until my Spitfire disagreed with a Messerschmitt." Despite herself, Eleanor smiled. "Well, Lieutenant Harrison, you're lucky to be here. Many pilots don't get a second chance." "Don't I know it?" His blue eyes met hers with unexpected clarity. "And please call me James. Seems only fair since you'll be seeing me at my worst." Over the following weeks, James Harrison became one of Eleanor's regular patients. His injuries were significant: a broken leg, fractured ribs, burns along his right side, but not life-threatening. What made him unusual was his spirit. Where many men lay silent, eyes fixed on the ceiling, as they retreated into themselves, James remained engaged, curious, often making the nurses laugh despite the grimness of their surroundings. "Tell me about home," Eleanor said one afternoon as she changed his dressings. The ward was quieter than usual, a rare lull in the constant flow of casualties. "Virginia," James said, wincing slightly as she applied fresh bandages. "Rolling hills, forests, rivers clear enough to see to the bottom. My father raises horses, thoroughbreds." "It sounds lovely." "It is." His expression softened. "What about you? Always lived in Dover?" Eleanor shook her head. "London originally. My father is a professor at King's College. I moved here when the war started, they needed nurses, and I'd just finished my training." She didn't mention William. Somehow it felt disloyal to speak of him to another man, especially one who looked at her the way James sometimes did when he thought she wouldn't notice. "Someone waiting for you back in London?" James asked, as if reading her thoughts. Eleanor's hands stilled momentarily. "There was. Is. A fiancé? Somewhere in France now. We haven't had word in some time. James's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. I'm sorry. That must be difficult. It's war, Eleanor said simply. We all have our burdens to bear. As November turned to December, the weather grew harsher. Snow fell in brief, violent squalls, and the hospital wards were as cold as they were crowded. More and more wounded arrived daily, many suffering from exposure as much as from enemy fire. James improved steadily. He was moved from the critical ward to recovery, and Eleanor found herself making excuses to pass by, checking on him more often than strictly necessary. She told herself it was professional concern, nothing more. One evening, she found him attempting to stand, balancing precariously on his good leg. "Lieutenant Harrison," she exclaimed. "What do you think you're doing?" He grinned sheepishly. "Testing a theory." "And what theory is that?" "How quickly you can undo weeks of healing." She moved to his side, allowing him to lean on her as she guided him back to bed. "The theory that I'm going mad lying here all day," he admitted. "I need to move, Eleanor. I need to feel useful again." It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it in his American accent sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Well, there are proper ways to begin physical therapy," she said, trying to maintain her professional demeanor. "Ways that don't involve you falling and breaking your other leg." James laughed, the sound drawing glances from nearby beds. Laughter was still rare enough in the wards to be noteworthy. "Tomorrow," Eleanor promised, "I'll speak with Dr. Collins about beginning your rehabilitation. But only if you promise to behave yourself tonight." "On my honor," James said, raising his right hand in a mock pledge. As she turned to leave, he caught her wrist gently. "Eleanor, thank you. For everything." The touch of his fingers against her skin lingered long after she had left the ward. Winter deepened, and with it, the war. The Blitz intensified, with London bearing the brunt of the Luftwaffe's fury. Dover, with its strategic position, saw its share of bombings too. The hospital staff worked around the clock, often to the sound of air raid sirens and distant explosions. James progressed from walking with crutches to using a cane. His burns healed, leaving scars that he joked would improve his rugged appeal. By January, he was helping around the hospital, his pilot's knowledge of mechanics proving useful in maintaining the temperamental generator that provided their limited electricity. They fell into a pattern, Eleanor and James. Their conversations extended beyond patient and nurse, covering books they'd read, places they'd visited, dreams they'd had before the war changed everything. They never spoke of what would happen when he was fully recovered, when he would inevitably be sent back to his squadron or home to America. And Eleanor never spoke of William. The lack of news had become its own kind of answer, though she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge it fully. The letter remained in her pocket, a talisman of a life that seemed increasingly distant. It was during one of Dover's frequent power outages that something shifted between them. Eleanor was checking on patients by lamplight when the sound of piano music drifted down the corridor. Curious, she followed it to the hospital's small chapel. James sat at the ancient upright piano, his fingers moving deftly over the keys. The melody was soft, melancholic, yet somehow hopeful too. Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching as he played, his face peaceful in the warm glow of the single lamp beside him. When the piece ended, he looked up and saw her. "Chopin," he explained. "My mother insisted on lessons, said a gentleman should be able to entertain at gatherings." "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, moving into the room. "I didn't know you played." "There's a lot we don't know about each other," James replied, his voice quiet in the dim room. "War has a way of fast-forwarding some things and suspending others." Eleanor sat beside him on the piano bench, careful to maintain a proper distance. "Play something else." He began again, a different piece, lighter and more playful. "Debussy," he said without pausing. "Clair de Lune." They sat in the chapel for over an hour, James playing whatever came to mind, Eleanor listening, occasionally humming along to pieces she recognized. It was the most peaceful either had felt in months. "I received orders today," James said suddenly, his hands stilling on the keys. "Once I'm cleared by the doctors, I'm to report to a base near London. They're forming a new squadron." Eleanor's stomach tightened, though she had known this moment would come. "When?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. He turned to face her, their knees almost touching on the narrow bench. "Eleanor, I." The air raid siren cut through the night, its wail piercing and insistent. They both froze, then moved as one toward the door. "Main ward," Eleanor said, automatically shifting into her nurse's role. "The patients who can't move." "I'll help," James finished, already moving ahead of her down the darkened corridor. The raid that night was one of the worst Dover had experienced. The hospital took a direct hit to its eastern wing, though thankfully that section had been emptied for repairs. Still, the blast shattered windows throughout the building, and flying glass caused numerous injuries. Eleanor worked tirelessly, moving from patient to patient, treating cuts, calming fears, evacuating those nearest the damaged section. Through it all, James was beside her, his cane forgotten as adrenaline and necessity overcame physical limitations. It was nearly dawn when the all-clear finally sounded. Eleanor sat heavily on an empty bed, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming her. James appeared with 2 cups of tea, somehow still hot. "You're a miracle worker?" she murmured, accepting the cup gratefully. "Just friendly with the kitchen staff," he replied, sitting beside her. His face was smudged with soot, a small cut on his cheek still seeping blood. Without thinking, Eleanor reached up to dab at it with her handkerchief. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. James caught her hand, holding it against his face for a moment before slowly lowering it. "I should have died in that plane," he said softly. "By all accounts, I shouldn't have made it back across the channel with the damage we took. Do you know what I thought about? In those moments when I was sure it was the end." Eleanor shook her head, unable to speak. "I thought about all the things I hadn't done. The places I hadn't seen. The words I hadn't said to people who mattered." His eyes never left hers. "I promised myself if I survived, I wouldn't waste any more time." "James," Eleanor began, but he continued. "I know about William. I know you're waiting for him. But Eleanor, it's been months without word. And he stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "I'm not asking you for promises. I'm just asking you not to close yourself off to possibilities." Before she could respond, Mrs. Hargrove appeared at the end of the ward. "Bennett, posts arrived, what's left of it after that raid. There's something for you." The letter was dirty, creased, and had clearly passed through many hands before reaching her. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable, though, and Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened it. William was alive. Captured in the early days after Dunkirk, he had been in a prisoner camp in occupied France. The letter was brief, written under the watchful eyes of German censors, but the message was clear. He was surviving. He was thinking of her. He was hoping to come home. Eleanor sat alone in the chapel, the letter spread before her on the piano keys. The feelings washing through her were complex: relief, joy, confusion. William was alive. The man she had promised to marry before the world descended into chaos was coming back to her, or at least there was hope he would. And yet, the door opened quietly, and James stood there, silhouetted against the corridor light. "Mrs. Hargrove told me," he said simply. "I'm glad for you, Eleanor, truly." She looked up at him, this man who had come into her life so unexpectedly, who had shown her that even in the darkest times, connection was possible. "James, You don't need to explain," he said, stepping into the room. "We're in the middle of a war. Nothing is simple." Eleanor stood, crossing to him. "No, it isn't simple. But that doesn't mean it isn't real. What's happened between us?" James's expression was carefully controlled. "And William? I made a promise to him," Eleanor said quietly. Before everything changed. Before I changed." She looked down at the letter, then back at James. "I need time. To think. To understand what I feel." "Time is something none of us are guaranteed," James said, but his voice was gentle. "Especially now." "I know." Eleanor stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth of him. "But I'm asking for it anyway." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. The hospital was partially rebuilt, patients were transferred, and new casualties arrived daily. Eleanor and James maintained a careful distance, professional and polite in their interactions, but the undercurrent between them was palpable to anyone paying attention. Eleanor wrote to William a long letter explaining everything that had happened since his capture. She was honest about her work, about Dover, about the fear and uncertainty. She was honest about everything except James. That she couldn't put into words yet, not when she herself didn't understand it fully. The day before James was due to leave for his new assignment, Eleanor was called to Dr. Collins's office. A telegram had arrived from London. William had been repatriated in a prisoner exchange, but he was gravely ill with pneumonia, complicated by malnutrition and the conditions of the camp. He was asking for her. Within hours, Eleanor was on a train to London, her few possessions packed hastily, leave from the hospital granted immediately. She had no time to find James, to explain, to say goodbye. She left a note with Mrs. Hargrove instead, a few inadequate lines that couldn't possibly convey everything she felt. William was barely recognizable, his once robust frame skeletal, his face gaunt and gray. But his eyes lit up when she entered the London hospital room, and his hand, when it found hers, held with surprising strength. "You came," he whispered, his voice raspy from coughing. "Of course I came," Eleanor replied, tears threatening. This was William, her William, but he was also a stranger now, transformed by experiences she could hardly imagine. They talked as much as his strength allowed. He told her of the camp, of the men who had kept each other alive through sheer determination, of the small acts of resistance that had maintained their humanity. She told him of Dover, of the hospital, of watching the channel each day and wondering. She did not tell him about James, not yet, perhaps not ever. William's recovery was slow but steady. By March, he was strong enough to sit up for extended periods, to eat solid food, to walk short distances with assistance. Eleanor divided her time between his bedside and volunteer work at the London hospital, where her experience was sorely needed. It was during an air raid, as they huddled with other patients in the hospital basement, that William told her, "You've changed, Ellie." The old nickname, nearly forgotten, brought a lump to her throat. "We've all changed," she said carefully. "How could we not?" William studied her face in the dim emergency lighting. "No, it's more than that. You're stronger. More certain?" He paused. "And there's something else." "Someone else?" Eleanor couldn't lie to him, not after everything he'd survived. There was a possibility. "An American pilot I helped treat. Nothing happened, William. Nothing improper. But you felt something," he finished for her. His expression was unreadable. "Yes," she admitted. "I felt something." William was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he might not speak again. Finally, he said, "Do you love him?" The question hung between them, weighted with all the complexities of their situation. "I don't know," Eleanor answered honestly. "I know I care for him. I know he made me feel alive during a time when everything seemed shrouded in death." She took William's hand. "But I know I loved you first. I know I promised myself to you." "Promises made before the war," William said softly. "We were different people then, Ellie. Does that make them less binding?" William looked around the crowded basement, at the faces illuminated by flashlights and candles. "This war has taken so much from so many. I've seen men lose limbs, homes, families. I've seen them lose their minds from what they've witnessed." His eyes found hers again. "I won't let it take your happiness too. Not if I can help it." "William." "No, listen to me. I'm not giving you up, not unless you tell me to. But I'm also not holding you to words spoken in a different world." He squeezed her hand. "Find your American. Talk to him. Be certain." The search for James proved more difficult than Eleanor had anticipated. His squadron had been deployed, then redeployed as the RAF adjusted to changing fronts. Letters sent to his last known location were returned. Inquiries through official channels yielded little information beyond his current status, active duty. Spring turned to summer. William's health improved enough for him to be discharged from the hospital, though he would never be strong enough to return to active service. They settled into a small flat in London, not as husband and wife. That step seemed impossible without resolution, but as companions bound by shared history and genuine affection. Eleanor continued her nursing work, now at a civilian hospital treating Blitz victims. Life developed a rhythm, punctuated by air raids, rationing challenges, and small victories on distant fronts. It was on a rare day off, while helping with the harvest at a farm outside London, part of the national effort to bolster food supplies, that Eleanor saw him. James stood across the field, directing a group of convalescent soldiers in gathering potatoes. His legs still troubled him. She could see it in the way he favored his left side. But he was alive, vital, real. For a moment she couldn't move. Then, as if sensing her presence, he looked up. Even at a distance, she could see the recognition dawn on his face, followed by disbelief, then something like joy. They met in the middle of the field, stopping a few feet apart, suddenly shy despite everything they had shared. "Eleanor," he said, her name almost a question. "James?" She took in the changes in him, new scars, a deeper tan, a certain weathered quality that hadn't been there before. "I looked for you. I was in North Africa," he explained, then Italy. Communications were challenging. She nodded, acutely aware of the other workers watching with curious eyes. "And now?" "Grounded," he said with a rueful smile. "Permanently. Too many crashes, even for the RAF's desperate standards. I'm helping coordinate training for new pilots." He hesitated. "I went to Dover after. They told me you'd gone to London. For William." "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "He was in a prisoner camp. He's recovering well. Understanding passed over James's face, a brief shadow quickly controlled. I'm glad, he said, and appeared to mean it. He's a fortunate man. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. We should talk, Eleanor said finally. Properly. Not here. They arranged to meet the following day at a small tea shop in Bloomsbury, neutral ground away from both their current lives. Eleanor told William where she was going, who she was meeting. He had kissed her cheek and said simply, be honest. With him and with yourself. The tea shop was quiet, most Londoners too busy with war work for such luxuries. James was already there when she arrived, seated at a corner table, his cane leaning against the wall beside him. You look well, he said as she sat across from him. A kind lie, Eleanor replied with a small smile. Rationing and long hours had left their mark on everyone in London. She knew she was thinner, more drawn than she had been in Dover. They talked of superficial things at first, his experiences in North Africa, her work at the London hospital, the changing tide of the war now that America was fully engaged. Gradually, the conversation turned to more personal matters. I received your note, James said. Before I was deployed, Miss Hargrove made sure it reached me. Eleanor nodded, remembering the hasty words she'd scribbled. It wasn't enough. There was so much more I wanted to say. Such as? She met his gaze directly. That I wasn't running away. That finding William didn't erase what happened between us in Dover. She stopped, collecting herself. That I thought of you every day. James was silent for a moment, stirring his tea unnecessarily. And William? Have you told him about me? Yes, Eleanor said. He knows everything. And he's a better man than either of us deserve, she said softly. He says the war has taken enough from everyone, that he won't let it take my happiness too. James's expression was complex, a mixture of surprise, respect, and something like hope. What do you want, Eleanor? Not what you promised before the war, not what you feel obligated to do now. What do you want? The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. Eleanor looked down at her hands, then back at James. I want what everyone wants. A future not defined by air raids and casualty lists. A chance to build something lasting. She took a deep breath. I want to be true to the promises I've made, but I also want to be true to who I've become. And who is that? James asked gently. Someone who understands that love isn't always convenient or simple. Someone who knows that the heart doesn't always follow the rules we set for it. She reached across the table, not quite touching his hand but close. Someone who cares deeply for two very different men, for very different reasons. James nodded slowly. So where does that leave us? Eleanor smiled, sad but genuine. In the middle of a war, trying to figure out what comes next, just like everyone else. They parted that day without definitive answers, but with a promise to keep in touch, to not let the vagaries of war separate them again. Eleanor returned to the flat she shared with William, to the complicated reality of her life. The war continued. The tide turned slowly but inexorably toward Allied victory. London began to breathe again as the bombings became less frequent, then ceased entirely. William's health stabilized, though he would never regain his full strength. James remained in England, his work with pilot training keeping him in the country, even as many American forces deployed to the continent for the final push. The three of them, Eleanor, William, and James, developed an unusual friendship, born of mutual respect and the shared understanding that conventional rules had little place in a world turned upside down by global conflict. They met occasionally for dinners, for concerts when they were available, for walks in London's parks when the weather permitted. It was during one such walk, in the spring of 1945, with victory in Europe finally on the horizon, that William took Eleanor's hand and said, I've been offered a position at Oxford, teaching history, once the university fully reopens after the war. William, that's wonderful, Eleanor said sincerely. His academic career, interrupted by the war, had been a casualty she had particularly mourned. It would mean leaving London, he continued, starting fresh somewhere new. The implication was clear. Eleanor looked across the park, where James stood feeding the ducks, giving them a moment of privacy. Are you asking me to come with you? William's smile was gentle. I'm asking you to do what makes you happy, Ellie. If that's Oxford with me, I'll be the most fortunate man alive. If it's something else, someone else, he glanced toward James, then I'll understand. We've all survived too much to settle for half-lives. Eleanor felt tears well up in her eyes. How did I find someone so good? "Just lucky, I suppose," William replied with a hint of his old humor. "But Eleanor? Whatever you decide, decide it fully. No divided hearts. That wouldn't be fair to any of us." As VE Day approached, bringing with it the promise of peace in Europe, Eleanor knew she had to make her choice. Not because either man demanded it, but because the future, that almost forgotten concept, was suddenly more than a distant hope. On the evening before the official announcement of Germany's surrender, Eleanor sat alone in the small garden behind their flat. The air was warm, fragrant with the scent of early roses. The world stood on the cusp of something new, and so did she. In the end, the choice wasn't about weighing one man against the other. It wasn't about obligations or promises or the complicated arithmetic of the heart. It was about listening to her deepest self, the woman she had become through fire and loss and unexpected joy. The next morning, as London erupted in celebration, as strangers embraced in the streets and flags appeared in every window, Eleanor Bennett made her choice. And like the peace so dearly bought, it was imperfect, complicated, and entirely worth the journey that had led to it.